Procedural due process. The Due Process Clause of both the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment restrict governmental actions, but the Fifth Amendment restricts only the national government, and the 14th Amendment restricts only the state governments. It's important to know which type of governmental actors you're dealing with to determine which type of rights are going to arise and whether to invoke the Fifth Amendment or the 14th Amendment. Due process itself comes in two different flavors: procedural due process and substantive due process. Like procedural and substantive law, procedural due process deals with the rules. It says the rules by which a law is implemented must be fair. Substantive due process, on the other hand, deals with the content of the law. The content of the law itself must be fair. In this section, we are going to look at procedural due process. Procedural due process essentially is based on the concept of fundamental fairness. When you are facing a deprivation of your rights, something kicks in and has to happen in order for those rights to be taken away. If there is a threat to your life, liberty, or property, then something has to happen procedurally before that threat can be actualized. You have to be adequately notified of the charges or the proceedings. You have to have an opportunity to be heard at the proceedings. And the person or panel making the final decision over the proceedings must be impartial. That means that they don't lean toward one side or another in regards to the matter before them. This is the reason why if you have a judge who has a conflict of interest in some way, they must recuse themselves and say that they cannot preside over the hearing because of the conflict of interest. The clause also promises that before depriving a citizen of life, liberty, or property, the government must follow fair procedures. In other words, it's not enough for the government just to act in accordance with the law itself. They actually have to follow specific procedures, and if they don't follow those specific procedures, they are denying you the process that is due, and that would be unconstitutional. They would be in violation of the 14th or the 5th Amendment, depending on what type of governmental action you are dealing with. What process is due and when? The boundaries of due process aren't fixed. They're constantly changing through case law, and we see this really going through a lot of different iterations in the judicial branch in terms of their interpretation and their decision making. The three things, though, that we mentioned before are things that have always stood out as really being the hallmarks of what has to happen with due process. You always have to have notice. You have to know what's going on. Someone has to inform you that your liberty or property is being taken away from you, for example, or your life for that matter. There's always an assurance of impartiality, meaning that there always has to be some sort of arbiter who has no stake in the situation one way or another. And there always has to be an explanation of the basis of the decision. Let's talk about a case to illustrate this point. In 1970, we had the case of Goldberg versus Kelly. Mrs. Kelly was receiving state-administered welfare benefits, and she was told that she was just going to be terminated. She wasn't going to be receiving them anymore. Of course, Mrs. Kelly relied heavily on these benefits in order to support herself and her family, and so she had a problem with the fact that this particular state, was New York, was just going to take them away. The particular benefits that Mrs. Kelly was receiving were sponsored by the state. And so the state was the one who kind of doled out the money. The state was the one who dealt with this particular program. And so we kind of understood that there may be some sort of due process that said that Mrs. Kelly should get a hearing. But the big question here was, if Mrs. Kelly is due a hearing, when is it due? Timing is everything here. If she got a hearing after she was terminated, then it could be a situation where the hearing wouldn't come for a few months, she wouldn't get her benefits, and that would be possibly her entire income, which she wouldn't be receiving for a couple of months. So should she have received a hearing before the state-administered welfare was terminated or after? And the court looked at this of, really we have to look at what the seriousness is of the particular termination to determine what type of process should be due. In this case, is it really serious that Mrs. Kelly have her hearing before we terminate her benefits? Or can it wait? Is this something that we can do after her termination happens, and then we can look back and see retrospectively whether or not it's something that should have happened or whether or not something that should have been done? The Goldberg versus Kelly decision came out with some very important ideas for procedural due process. The first thing which it's important to remember is that this case created the presumption that hearings must come first. So before a state can deprive you of your state-administered benefits, they must allow you to have a hearing first. Not afterwards, not after they've taken the benefits away from you. You are entitled to a hearing if you invoke one before the actual termination. A couple of other things that Goldberg versus Kelly established that are very important. The state must provide a hearing before an impartial judicial officer. Now, remember, we're talking here not about court cases. This isn't, this particular case, Goldberg versus Kelly, was a court case, but this isn't talking about just you need to have due process in the event that someone decides to sue somebody else. This due process is required whenever a state acts. So the fact that the state actor, New York, was the one terminating Mrs. Kelly's benefits meant that the state itself, in the particular program which was administering the benefits, has to be the one in its program to provide a hearing before an impartial judicial officer. So this isn't they have to bring Mrs. Kelly to court. It's not Mrs. Kelly has to sue them. It's she has the right to a hearing before termination of her benefits within the program which is administered by the state. Very important. Secondly, it established the right to an attorney's help. She can actually go and get an attorney to represent her or assist her in representing herself at this impartial hearing. Again, has nothing to do with court, but an attorney can be there to assist her in making sure that her rights are not taken from her without proper process. Thirdly, she has a right to present evidence and argument orally. So she has the right to say to give a defense of herself as to why she should not have her particular rights taken from her. In this case, her particular right to have her subsidized, or her benefits, her welfare benefits from the state. And then she was afforded a chance to examine the materials or to confront and cross-examine adverse witnesses. All of this came out of this case, and it sounds very similar to having what seems to be a mini trial within the program itself, and sometimes it acts like that, but it really comes from the right to, before you're deprived of anything, just like in criminal law, before you're deprived of your freedom, you have to be able to have your right to an attorney's help, your right to defend yourself in court, and your right to confront and cross-examine witnesses. Of course, all of that comes into the criminal context when we're looking, say, for example, at the Sixth Amendment, which brings us the confrontation clause in criminal law. But we didn't have this in the civil arena, which dealt with state actors. And so now we have this landmark case in 1970, which was going to give us all of these rights, even outside of court, even within the state arena of a particular state or national program, so that we have the right to not only have a hearing, but have a hearing with an impartial judicial officer, have an attorney's help with that hearing, and then present evidence and confront and cross-examine the witnesses that are brought against us. So huge landmark case in Goldberg versus Kelly, and quite a good example of procedures which must be in place, and the state having to do things in a particular way. Even if the state had a good reason for terminating Mrs. Kelly's welfare benefits, say she violated a particular rule of the program, if the state did not follow the proper procedure, say they did not afford her a hearing, then her particular benefits could not be taken away from her because they failed to act in accordance with due process.